And we're back. Welcome to Homer Bound, a podcast where a couple nerds read through and discuss Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I, of course, am Wriste.
And I am Llama.
Awesome. Welcome back, I suppose. Welcome back literally and also literally, I guess, but you just got back from a long trip, you said, right?
Yeah, I went to the beach this weekend to meet my friend's kid. It was great.
It sounds tiring.
I fortunately managed to not anger Poseidon too much while I was there. Only got rained on a teeny bit, but yeah.
And luckily
there and back.
you made it all safe without any weird weather, unlike last night. For the dedicated listeners, you'll know that last time Llama took a trip, there was heavy rain.
Yes.
But now this time there wasn't.
This time I got lucky.
My mind is still very much, I mean, we've obviously moved past book 16, but with that awesome discussion with Dr. Daniel, my mind is still sort of living in book 16. I had a lot to think about.
I was thinking about this the entire time I was gone. I'm still thinking about it. What an incredibly riveting conversation. Like, that was just so much fun.
The thing that I think impacted me the most, it was one thing we talked about in book 16 and one of the tags where one of Dr. Daniel's tags, end of episode tags, where he suggested a pushback against the idea that the Iliad is, I guess, an anti-war story. And it's more of just I guess it does sort of both, right? It gives you reason to dislike war and to find it disgusting and horrible, but it seems fair to fairly clearly, offer up glory and fame and all that sort of stuff, which is sort of what people want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked kind of his explanation about how over the course of time, that message has kind of changed for us. With modern conceptions of society and morals and values and so forth. That conception of, the anti-war story was completely different. And I really appreciated his input on that. In the sense that, this was intended to glorify at a certain point in time, and maybe time has changed that. Maybe it still offers some of that to us, maybe even back then it offered a little bit of anti-war sentiment, but mostly served to glorify. The point is it just evolved with time.
The thing about the Iliad that makes it so interesting and so necessarily difficult to read, but weird to talk about as compared to, like, say, other works of literature, which is that a lot of things feel so value-free. Like, for instance, like a really small example was when we talked about, what was Achilles' tone when he greeted Patroclus crying. We don't really know. We have to read that in for ourselves, and it could be a bunch of things, and it could also, just be up to the interpretation of the particular poet who's giving us that particular poem on that particular day. So
yeah, and kind of going back to what Dr. Daniel has said about, these works as performances. Like, who knows how many performances of this were given back in the day, and how much did the interpretation change every time, from one given performance to another. Like, there's got to be so much variation in the way that this story has been told in the past and will continue to be told in the future. It's a really interesting kind of variance that just means that you can interpret. Like, the one thing I love about this experience with you is realizing just how many ways there are to interpret any given passage in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's crazy. You can assign so much meaning to so many things, and each person will have a different take on it.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that, I mean, this is like in a weird middle ground between like a play and I guess what we would consider a novel or like a more straightforward like story.
A fictional work.
Yeah, because this is on one hand like a front to back story that you're meant to experience, but also, why would you say in text, and this is how they said it, when it's already being said? What that would be redundant. Right?
Yeah.
Like, why would you say that? I mean, it's sometimes there. We sometimes get some description of how the characters say things, but there aren't like individual stage directions or any such thing. It's kind of left up to us or the performer.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I took away from it that I just want to, I guess, touch on real quick was that I never really considered that Patroclus wasn't a perfect angel, which is weird because it's sort of the inverse of what I've been upset about with what appears to be sort of a general cultural response to like Agamemnon, where like Agamemnon is just like pure evil all the time. And I mean, I can blame the poem a little bit because it really wants us to really like Patroclus, but even in that little part where Patroclus sort of gives ground to the hunt for glory and him relishing in his own power and strength, like that, it reminds us that Patroclus isn't like, he's not a paragon so much above what I guess what his society or his people or his values have just sort of imposed on him over the course of his life. He's not immune to those things.
Yeah, he's human.
As we'd like him to be.
He is a human. He is fallible. He is flawed. He is, susceptible to the same wants and desires as all of us are, and as the people surrounding him are. I think that it was really interesting to have that pointed out, and kind of fleshed out a little bit more for us. And it's just a really interesting, but I also think it's a really interesting juxtaposition with the rest of his portrayal, because it kind of gives you that most human moment followed by another most human moment, which is death. And it strikes this balance of like, that one moment where he kind of exposes his fatal flaw is that he's human. And in so many other ways, like his empathy, his, for humanity, and then, the greed for glory. Both of those very human elements of him are followed by the most human element of all, which is mortality.
Oh, I dig that. It seems correct. There's we don't get much from Patroclus, but I love the sort of things we can get out of book 16, even though it's kind of the only one that really like zooms in on Patroclus and gives us a close look at what he's all about. Before we begin on book 17, there's something that occurred to me when I was watching The Suicide Squad today, and it made me think of something that I hadn't, I guess, connected. It's not even a connection. It's just, it made a lot of sense. Remember when we talked about how it seems as though Hector is sort of being pushed on, like they keep turning the key even though he's got sort of nothing left, or it seems like he should have nothing left. Like he's been knocked down and lifted up like a bunch of times.
Keep winding him up like a little toy soldier.
Yeah, and even other characters in book 17, which we're about to talk about, Ajax is kind of in a similar boat where just a few books ago he was like sweating and tired.
Yeah, all these guys are running on total fumes.
Yeah, and when I was watching The Suicide Squad, and I think this is relevant to any, like, I guess, drama where there's a person or a human or what have you or like a regular human who's doing things. I was like, man, they must be really exhausted from doing all these. They're running, they're fighting, they're getting beat up, they're taking damage, doing these acrobatics, really exerting themselves throughout the entire movie. And I couldn't help but think of those times when the Iliad describes Poseidon giving fresh fighting strength into warriors' arms and legs and their chests, or Apollo getting Hector back up. It made that make sense to me in a way that I hadn't really considered.
That's fascinating. I have not seen The Suicide Squad, but I definitely, I don't know, I relate to that feeling as a person who is constantly exhausted. And having to kind of find that energy within you, and sometimes not really knowing where it came from. It's a fairly familiar feeling to me.
Yeah, and to zoom forward just a little bit, that exhaustion will be addressed in book 19. Just how hard the Achaeans have been pushed. Achilles will want to jump right into battle, but Odysseus will tell him, these guys need to rest, they need to eat. They haven't
Yeah, it's
eaten
like,
in.
hey, bro, while you've been waiting on the sidelines, doing nothing, we've actually been fighting here. We need a rest.
Yes, I guess the ebb and flow of human exhaustion was recontextualized for me
Oh,
just a little
yeah.
bit as I was watching the Suicide Squad. As weird as that sounds, because they have nothing to do with the Suicide Squad has nothing to do with the Iliad, but it just made me think about it.
You know
And
what, though? I think life is like that, where, like, sometimes when you're watching something completely, or, listening, or just experience something completely unrelated to, like, something you read a while ago, or something someone told you, or you thought about, and then all of a sudden that last puzzle piece clicks in, and you're like, oh, I know this has nothing to do with that, but now that makes sense.
yeah,
That happens
yeah.
to me all the time. I think that's just like a natural kind of, like, sometimes that last puzzle piece is just waiting somewhere off yonder, off yonder way, and you find it, and then you're just like, oh, this concept that was kind of scratching at the back of my head.
This might explain why I tend to like some things that some people just don't like, or
Could
I
be.
find joy in things that or like anyone would find joy in something that means a lot to them, and you show that to someone else, and they say, "I don't get it," and it's because they're missing that little puzzle piece, or not. I don't know.
I don't know. It's amazing how life works like that, though.
The Iliad. I've lost my mind to the Iliad.
Not sure I would say I've lost my mind, but I will say that it now inhabits a cozy little shelf on my brain with a bunch of
It's
other fine leather-bound books.
as we were talking about, even just like the mirrored images or the repeated images of book 16, it made me think about how absolutely stressful and wild it must be to translate the Iliad. Like, because you don't want to lose those little things, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
something like Patroclus's like death stanza being repeated, it seems like it might be easy, but there are a bunch of other little things, smaller, less obvious things that I suspect might get lost if you're not paying attention. So you're constantly like having a crazy board between like all these different points of the Iliad that you have to make sure you're keeping straight. And I don't know, is imagining it. I mean, just
That
reading it
that
is
exhausts
wild.
me. The idea of that exhausts me. And but on that note, do you want to get into book 17?
Yes, I'm down to get into
Okay, and before
book
we do that,
17.
however, we should issue our content warning.
Oh yeah.
We
Okay.
need to
You
do
want to
that
do the content
very
warning?
briefly. We are teenagers in the bodies of grown people. We have potty mouths at times. And also, the Iliad deals with some themes of violence, mature themes. Also, mature themes in the sense of hugging and kissing, although there's, I think, less of that
I
in
think
the.
we've gotten past that
We've
now.
we've
So if you're
gotten
just
through
joining us,
most of the sexy content, sadly.
yes.
But there
Sadly.
is still plenty of violence and gore to come. So, viewer, listener, beware. And
Dear listener,
children,
viewer.
be cautious. And if your parents are okay with you listening to this, then that's fine. And if they're not, go away.
I like
Or
that we're
not.
sort of implicitly living in
Don't
this
listen to
fantasy
your
world
parents.
where we're like a child for whom it would be inappropriate to discuss sexy topics would also be listening to a podcast about the Iliad. Seems like a mismatch to me, but
It does, but and yet here we are issuing a warning to any such child should you exist.
perhaps we should have thought this through before. And by we, I mean me, of course. But yeah, let's get into book 17. I feel like book 17 is fairly straightforward, although there are a few things that we should probably highlight. Most notably, as both Fagles seems to think, since this book 17 is called Menelaus' Finest Hour, and Dr. Daniel identified this as Menelaus' Aristeia, his book of excellence. I think it's interesting to read this book as Menelaus's Aristeia. I'm beginning to like that word more and more. Aristeia is
It's a great word.
so cool. It sounds very balletic and yet
As always, many
warlike.
thanks to Dr. Dan for giving us fun new words to use. I love it.
Yes, but this is a particularly, I think, unique Aristeia. Most of the books that I suspect are intended to be, or explicitly or not, usually involve a lot of great killing. Agamemnon, he kills a bunch of people. Diomedes just fights the gods and he kills a whole bunch of people, and so on and so forth. But Menelaus only kills a couple people. His excellence isn't necessarily in his martial abilities, at least in this, I guess, Aristeia.
Yeah, it's a contrast to the other, finest hour books that we've had. These
Mm.
Aristeias, Aristeiae. I don't know Greek words.
Well, Aristeias. We
Um,
can anglicize it just a little bit for our own benefit and convenience.
but I don't know. Every time I've read this book, I'm just struck by like the sense of raw power that you feel from Menelaus.
I mean, in the first few lines, Menelaus is talking big game, and he is repeatedly described as a lion. In this book, we're fighting over Patroclus's body, and Menelaus, he spots that Patroclus is dead. He comes up to protect it, and he's ready to go. And it opens up with him killing Euphorbus, who I believe is the guy who stabbed Patroclus in the back in the last
Yes.
book, and he's here for his kill.
And he ain't gonna get it.
No, Menelaus pushes him back. But so the thing is, we haven't really seen much of Menelaus's fighting strength. We've seen him fight Paris, but it seems like most competent warriors could probably beat Paris in a one-on-one battle.
It
That's fair to
also,
say.
that always felt to me like almost kind of more of a show match, if there was one, in this epic poem.
Yeah, well, in book three, it seemed clear to everyone who was going to win. Like Priam didn't even think Paris had a chance. I mean, no one did.
Graham just sends Paris out there, and he's like, "Okay, Pat, you'll be okay, maybe."
Well, not even Pat. Remember Priam, coming out onto the battlefield and agreeing to the truce. He leaves because he says he doesn't want to watch one of his sons die, which means that the outcome is sort of a foregone conclusion, and were it not for Aphrodite, it absolutely would have been. But I
Yeah,
wouldn't say that if Menelaus had a fine hour, it was not in his battle against Paris, and Agamemnon has kind of, for the most part, been holding him back just a little bit. He doesn't give him opportunities for glory, presumably out of the kindness of his own heart, or his concern for his brother, which I have no reason to believe is not genuine. I don't suspect that Agamemnon thinks that Menelaus will steal his power, and we've seen or his glory, and we've seen little bits of Menelaus fighting, and he's strong. We haven't really seen him, as you like to say, kirk out.
yeah, and I think the biggest thing that I take away from like his appearances is, one of his epithets is God, or God of the War Cry, right?
Yes.
And that is where his power really seems to come from, and it comes out in this book certainly.
This Aristea, as I said, he only kills a couple people, but where I think his excellence comes from in this book is his ability to bring people around. And as you said, the war cry, and I'm unsure of exactly what the significant. We sort of glossed over these war cries, but they seem really, really important. There's something, I don't know. There's something about them. Everyone has a war cry, or everyone has unleashed their own war cry. Odysseus did so when he was cornered in, I think, book 11. We're going to see a cool one from Achilles in book 18, our next book.
The war cry to end all war cries, really.
Yeah. But Menelaus, his if we're to identify what his excellence is in this book, it seems like, as I said, his ability to bring people around, to command the battlefield. He's always like assembling people. He's bringing in Ajax, the two Ajaxes, He brings in Idomeneus and Meriones, and he's just always like commanding people on the battlefield around Patroclus. And so, if it weren't for his, I guess, presence of mind and his strength of will, and Patroclus's body would have probably been hauled away.
Yeah, and the other thing that I take away from, these passages in Menelaus' finest hour is not just his ability to really rouse and command people, but almost like when he cries out, it seems to instill strength into people. It seems to, like, in the same way that they've talked about gods kind of touching people and putting strength into them, his battle cry seems to have that kind of quality that enables people to really get juiced up and kill a bunch of other people or defend or, protect Patroclus's body in this case.
I guess if we're to identify the functions of a war cry, it's both to like rally the strength of your allies and to also, I guess, terrify your opponent. I'm curious as to what that is supposed to sound like. My brain sort of reads it as almost like animalistic or feral or something like that. But
this is the moment where I bring things back to Lord of the Rings again.
Oh, okay, all right.
You have seen those movies, I presume?
It's been a while since I've popped any of them in,
so I'll
but
hope
I
that
have watched them.
Any of you who have watched those movies out there and have seen Return of the King, when the riders of Rohan, like, charge the Pelennor fields, charge Gondor, kind of sandwiching all the orcs between the walls of Gondor and their horses, Theoden makes this speech and then screams out, "Death, death, death, ride now for Rohan," and blah, blah, blah. That is what I imagine that as. That kind of yelling out in absolute passion, and almost like you can almost kind of see him go beyond his own body with this cry that, like, in a normal situation, you would not think that every rider there could hear it, but they can. And it's beyond just, the power of a man's voice. It's his entire body and almost soul, like, propelling this shout into the ether. That is how I imagine that.
To continue the nerd track, have you I don't suspect you've played Bloodborne, but have you seen
I have seen a
Bloodborne
little bit
footage,
of it.
gameplay?
A little bit, yeah.
Do you recall this is a boss called Vicar Amelia?
No.
It's like a large, like, long-haired giant dog thing with hands. For those of you who don't know, Bloodborne is basically an eldritch horror slasher where you fight great monsters. I would encourage you to look up Vicar Amelia's cries, because as I said, she's basically a beast. She was a human, but when you fight her, she turns into this giant, as I said, like, sort of long-haired dog with hands and like a long snout and big teeth. And it's like she's howling like all the time. Like, you can tell it's sort of a human sound. It's also like a bellowing, sort of feral, animalistic sound that's probably coming from a human. So in my mind, whenever I think of like a really strong war cry, I imagine something that, I guess you imagine words, but I just think of like a sound or a noise.
Yeah, definitely. I think it could be either and or both.
But whatever feels most badass to you is probably that.
Yeah, I think so.
This is also excuse me. This is also the book where Hector puts on Achilles' armor. I think we mentioned that he takes and maybe puts it on in the last episode, but he doesn't actually, like, strap it in until this one. Since we're going to be going into the next episode, or the next book, we're going to be sort of grappling with images. What do these people look like? And as we sort of talked about again in the last episode, on book 16, we have all these like weird little images of Achilles flashing throughout the story, especially in these last couple books. And this is where Hector sort of puts himself in that place. And Hector, in a weird way, he not only does he sort of become like an image of Achilles in the same way that Patroclus does, but he also serves kind of a similar role that Patroclus did for the Achaeans, because when he puts it on, it describes him as like firing up all of his captains, and the book names all the captains, and it puts fighting strength back into them. So Hector, he's not only adopting the image of Achilles, he's also kind of adopting the image of Patroclus. He's taking on both.
I think it's the armor. So this is a little like pet theory of mine, but I mean, we've kind of brushed on this before. Like everyone who wears this armor is not Achilles, but they take on qualities of his, and in doing so, they provoke a reaction from the people that they are leading. I think it's the armor. I also think that what you were saying is very valid as well. Like, that in a way he almost adopts what Patroclus was to, the Achaeans.
At least his role in that particular instance.
I agree with that completely, but I think it's like almost a quality of the armor in that, like, by putting on that armor, I don't know.
If we're to follow the implications of this, and I have no idea if this is like a valid read, but Hector is kind of he seems almost like he's two people. There's we always have this image of Hector in book 6, back at home. He's talking about his countrymen. He's talking about he's talking with his wife and his son, and he's talking about why he needs to fight. And we have this sort of, I guess, what I would imagine to be sort of more pure or more grounded motivation. But then as time goes on, especially after he dons Achilles' armor, he changes a little bit. He becomes his demeanor, or at least it seems like his demeanor becomes different. Like he becomes more hot-headed, even becomes quite interested in glory, which again we'll talk about more in book 18, where we get some of the upshots.
You can kind of feel the fury rise within him. I think it's the armor. The armor has secret powers.
Well, if we are to make a sort of superficial connection between the Iliad and the Lord of the Rings, the armor bestows power, and it is also cursed in a way.
Oh, absolutely.
Because whoever wears it dies until the real thing shows up. I think it's important to remember that even though we have like these images of Achilles, they're all counterfeits. They're not the real thing.
Yeah, it's Achilles light.
Yeah, well, and the thing that that I don't know if I've talked about too much over the course of the podcast, but one thing that's really interesting about the Iliad is that it teases us with Achilles. It gives us Achilles in book 1, and it takes him away from us for a long time. Then we meet him again, and we're not going to see our main dude fight until book 21.
Yeah,
that's a while. Like
you get little sprinkles, and then when you finally do get him, though, it's so like awe-inspiring.
Yeah, and we're building up to it. We're given Achilles at home, and then we're sort of given these sort of counterfeit images of Achilles until we're finally going to get the real Achilles will stand up in book 18, and then he'll really arm up and go in book, I think, 21. So from a pure story pacing perspective, I think it's really cool and interesting that Achilles is sort of held back it's saving the best for last.
Oh, it makes complete sense. You're building the excitement and the anticipation for this character that everyone talks about like the entire time. The thing about it is Achilles actually is present in just about every book, just not physically.
Yes, absolutely.
His presence looms over this entire epic poem like a specter, a ghost. and no one can rid themselves of it. But physically, he's not there that much. He has these brief appearances, and you get, again, like you said, teased with that, actual person. And then all of a sudden, he's, after the death of Patroclus, he's brought into the conflict and finally actually just appears. And you pretty much don't see the end of him after that. Like, he's in just about everything following that. So, like, no longer a specter, he's the main dish. He is what is going on. And it's just, oh man, I get goosebumps getting into this, like, section of the book. It gets so exciting because you're finally...
It's what we've been building up to this whole time.
Exactly. It's so exciting.
I like also that we're given, like, the briefest snapshot of Achilles not knowing what's going on. It's like somewhere in the middle of book 17. But we're told that Achilles is just kind of waiting, and he has no idea that any of this is happening. And book 17 almost serves as like a mini version sort of the Iliad, where Achilles is sort of sitting back and he has no idea really what's happening, even if he is watching. I don't know. I thought it was cool that we were sort of reminded of where Achilles is in the soul space.
There's a section around like line 445 that goes on until like line 480 or so, which is a really awesome description of the labor of fighting and how much all of these people are putting into it, and that all of these things are like, it makes you feel like you're almost in the midst of it, with people going left, right, and center, and stretching the hide, and then shortly after that is when it talks about, like, and Achilles knew nothing of Patroclus dying, and it kind of suggests that he's, sitting there, he's like, he never dreamed that Patroclus would storm Troy. He couldn't imagine his death, and he's about to get this, like, super, super rude awakening.
It's a very clean image of, especially juxtaposed with that, like, the tension and then the battle fury that's described in that simile, where the hide is being stretched, followed by Achilles doesn't know what's going on. It serves to highlight how disconnected Achilles can be sometimes, or all the times.
Yeah, he's just kind of off to the side in his own head still. And, having sent Patroclus off and said, please don't die. Promise not to die.
In contrast, also, like, we've seen people fight over bodies, but we haven't seen any fight over a body this intense yet. We've seen little examples.
Yeah, this whole book is a long-term tug of war over Patroclus's body. Everyone wants this body for very different reasons, but the, passion with which they are going after it is intense on both sides.
On the Achaean side, I think it highlights, and perhaps they also want to deny the Trojans the glory of having Patroclus's body. To me, it also reads as, like, yeah, everyone knows who Patroclus is, and everyone loved him to the degree that they will rally around him so readily.
Well, I think it's a little bit of both.
Anyone else.
Like, in the sense that, like, they want to deny them the glory because of how much this person means to them. It's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. It's like, everyone knows this guy. Everyone cares about this guy. Everyone knows how important he is to Achilles. Everyone, knows the kind of person he is. Nobody wants to see this happen to his body, and they want to stick it to the Trojans.
And also, maybe cynically, perhaps Patroclus's body will rally Achilles to finally,
absolutely
get out of his tent and fight.
I absolutely read it that way. Like, it's of incredible importance to get it back for all of the, the aforementioned reasons. But I don't doubt that for, a while they're all thinking, like, if we get this body and put it in front of Achilles, he will go apeshit. And that is what we need. This is what we've been desperate for this entire time. And now we have the key to that in our hands, if we can get his body back.
Book 17 is also fairly dire because for all the work of the Achaeans, they can't seem to beat Hector off of it. They can't seem to beat him back, him or his Trojans. There's a part where when Hector puts on the armor, Zeus notices that he does this, and he's like, "Oh, well, I guess he's going to do this, so I'll give him some glory before he dies." And he gives him the power to fight once more, to fight with that fury that we've been talking about. And also there's a similarly interesting Zeus intervention where Ajax, actually it's more interesting for Ajax, because Ajax notices that they're about to be routed, and he prays to Zeus, and he says, "It's obvious that you want us to lose. You know, our weapons keep falling over, or keep missing their mark, while the Trojans' weapons all hit us, no matter who's throwing them or shooting them. If you're going to kill us, at least let us die out in the light, out in the broad daylight." I guess they're shrouded in mist, and Zeus lifts the mist from them. And so there's like Book 17 is sort of a quick flash in the pan example of like sort of the push and pull that we've been seeing in all the previous combat heavy books as well.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm trying to figure out how long this book is exactly, because I think it's one of the longer books, but
it's longish. The Fagles translation has it at 850 lines, which is longish.
Yeah, but there's a lot that happens in this book, but it all feels like it happened so quickly.
And lots of small details. You know, we have the Aeantes fighting. We get to see Idomeneus and Meriones. We see Hector back in action. We have Menelaus, of course, who's sort of always running around and rousing the troops to get them in position to defend Patroclus' body, but they also can't drag it back themselves because Hector is too strong. And I think that we could dig into, I guess, individual passages all day. As I've said, the big part of the fun of these battle books is reading those sort of little dramas that happen that are peppered throughout all the combats. But we don't have nearly the time to do a line by line reading. Not. So I think for me, I've talked about all that I want to talk about it right now. Was there anything else that stood out to you before we close out this book?
Not really. I think we've covered a lot of what I really love about this book, and obviously we have a lot to talk about with Book 18, which is the Shield of Achilles, which both of us, yes, I know, are very excited for, because we will have a guest with us.
Yes, a special guest, which, if you've read the title of this episode, you'll already know who she is. So I guess on that note, we'll end on a sort of weird stalemate between the Trojans and the Achaeans, where the Trojans are kind of winning, even though the Achaeans are holding their own ground. And we'll take our break and jump into Book 18. Stick around. Hello, dear listener. We hope you've enjoyed listening to the first part of this episode of Homer Bound. There's more to come afterward, but I'd like to take a moment on this break to say a few special thank yous. First, thank you for listening. This podcast has no sponsor. Everything is produced in-house, on our own time, and fueled by our own interests. Sharing in our interests means a great deal to us, and knowing that others enjoy the content means even more. Please follow us on our Twitter at Homer_bound for new episodes, or just keep an eye on the podcast page, wherever you happen to be listening. I'd like to give another special thank you to my friend Llama for hosting the show with me, and I'd like to thank the composer and performer of the music you've been hearing during the transitions, who has said he'd like to be known simply as Llama's father. Thank you, Llama's father. I'd also like to thank Bubbo for her contributions to the audio. Webs 2D for some original art, and Total Love for additional art and graphic design. And Ghosty, also for additional graphic design. Another special thank you to our numerous guests for lending us their time and expertise. And a last but not least thank you to Dr. Daniel, who anchors every one of our episodes with his insights on our discussions. We appreciate his time and energy, and we encourage you to stick around at the end of the episode to make sure you hear what he has to say. Please consider reading along with us as you listen. We are reading the Robert Fagles translation, and while reading the text isn't necessary for you to follow along, you'll likely get more out of the discussions if you have. Feel free to pause and return later if you wish to do so. Okay, thanks for sticking through our break. I'll give it back to me and Llama on Homeward Bound. And welcome back. I have refilled my water and stretched my legs, and Llama, hopefully you've done the same.
I have replenished my tea. I am ready to go. I'm very excited. We have a lovely guest with us.
Yes, Dr. Kira Jones. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
I guess I don't know exactly how to ask this, but how did you find yourself here? What forces thrust us together?
Right. Twitter, I believe. Yes. I saw Dan's post asking for people who could talk about the Iliad and specifically the Shield.
Yes.
And it's like, well, I know stuff about the Shield, so why not? It's always fun to talk with gamers, so let's do this.
I guess just for just real quick, what is your sort of area of interest or background or what have you? You said, you talk about gamers. I'm assuming you play a lot of games. That's sort of your field of expertise, interest?
Yeah, so I am a art historian / classicist, so I work a lot with material culture, things that you dig out of the ground and hold. I specialize in Greek and Roman self-representation, mythology, propaganda, religion, all that fun stuff. But in the past few years, I've really been focusing on how Greece and Rome get represented in modern media like comics and video games. Which of course brought me to Hades, which brought me into your circle.
Fabulous.
How would you say games are doing thus far, if you were to grade them?
I mean, here's the thing. This is I call it Dr. Jones's theory of reception, and
okay.
That is that it's not whether games get something right or wrong about antiquity, it's what they're changing and why. That's actually interesting. So, I mean, depending on the game, you're going to have, differences on a sliding scale of accuracy. Games like, Assassin's Creed Odyssey are going to be a little bit more what we think of as historically accurate, just because it's billing itself as a historical game. It's set in a historical period. Ignoring, all of the Isu and the superpowers and stuff like that. As I said, it's a sliding scale.
The weird time traveling powers are not historical.
Yeah. That we know of. But anyway.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
That's a fair caveat.
Thinking that to myself.
Yeah.
And then we are aware of.
You get games like Hades that follow the mythology very closely. So I would say that's also got a high scale of accuracy. And then you get games like Age of Mythology and Smite, which absolutely do not. But again, I mean, they're bringing in the ancient world for different ends there. So I would say as far as increasing engagement with Greece and Rome, video games are doing extremely well. Especially recently with Odyssey and Hades and Phoenix and some of the more indie type games, we're getting a lot of really interesting interpretations that are in turn getting a lot of people interested in ancient history. So that's always a great thing.
It's interesting that even like when we think of translation, we usually think of words like one language to another, but you're sort of it's the same sort of thing with the images. It depends on the translator's end and how they want to use those images. That's just as important as like it's really 1-to-1, right? It's
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, if we're talking about someone like Hercules, for example, there are at least 5 million different myths of Hercules. And, even people in antiquity were changing them based on what they wanted to get out of it. So you could have, in ancient Rome, for example, an emperor like Hadrian, who was really into traveling, boosted this idea of Hercules as a traveler, right? A guy who went all around the world bringing order and shit. And I forgot to ask you if we're okay with swearing on here.
Oh yeah, we've issued
absolutely
content
okay
warnings.
with swearing.
Okay, that's good.
We're children, we're gamers.
Okay.
We're good with the immature language.
Excellent.
I think it's better called.
Okay, so civilizing everything and shit, and then you get others like Commodus, who really want like a Roman centric Hercules. So he's going to really work to localize that character. Doesn't mean that either of them are wrong. It's just that people are manipulating these stories for different means.
Yeah, and he goes from Heracles to Hercules and all that
Heracles,
stuff.
Hercules, yeah, and many variations in between. So it's there's not really one accurate myth that we can go back to and say, okay, this is like myth prime that everything else devolves from. Even if we're working with text, I mean, there was artwork depicting the stories that was around before the text. So there's really no way to know which was the original story, and there's not much point in trying to figure it out anyways, because that's not what people use stories for at all, whether it's in ancient history or in video games today.
I think we've been grappling a little bit with that over the course of this podcast. We've been trying to keep it in text. Every so often, we have to reference stories out of text, like Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia, which is like the biggest one for us. But that's not canon in the Iliad. It didn't happen, and so how do we grapple with Agamemnon's character when we have these two conflicting stories almost?
And I love the perspective that you've just given us. In terms of, like, Wriste and I have talked many times before about kind of these stories as being in flux and evolving, and, especially through, like, the oral tradition, how they've evolved through that as well, and just kind of how many interpretations can you have of something? The answer is a whole fucking lot.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess on that note, why don't we jump into the Shield of Achilles? Book 18, entitled "The Shield of Achilles" by Robert Fagles, which is it's I guess on its face it's kind of weird because Achilles isn't just getting a shield; he's getting a whole set of armor. We'll get into sort of how this comes about later, but it's not just the shield; he's getting a whole set of arms, and yet at the end of this book, which I don't know about Llama, but I at least will need a lot of help trying to figure out what exactly is going on with this whack-ass shield.
I also need help constantly.
And just in general,
yeah, absolutely. In general, but also in terms of, as you said, this whack-ass shield. It is, I mean, there is so much going on in this book, and it's a lot of information to take in, and I don't understand the meaning of all of it. I definitely don't. I don't know about you, Wriste.
I think I understand like 95% of it.
Okay.
And the other 5% is
the part that's tickling the back of your brain.
My Kira, my for reference, my hubris is a running. I like to think it's a running joke, even though it's sometimes half true. Because I think I'm very smart, but I also have to joke about it. Otherwise, I'll run away with it. I'm sure you know what I mean.
I do. Yes, I have seen men on the internet.
Oh, I think you just became my favorite person.
Yay!
I love my own intelligence, okay? It's all I have.
That is just the best way to put that into words that could possibly have been said.
Yeah, speaking of men and how they think, let's start with Achilles, because I think we learn a lot about Achilles in this book, almost right from the get-go. Because I'm not sure if this is a prophecy that has appeared in previous myths, but Achilles sort of opens by talking to himself about how his mother brought him a prophecy that the greatest of the Myrmidons, aside from Achilles, would die while he was alive. And I think this is the first we're hearing about this, but it further changes how we see that scene where Achilles sends or allows Patroclus to go out and fight, because he knew that there was a prophecy that this would happen, that the greatest of the Myrmidons, aside from himself, would die. You say it would die here? Yeah, it would fall at Trojan hands. And he's talking about how, oh, I thought I could avoid it if I just told them to come back. Which, I don't know, it's yet another thing that we can say about Achilles that isn't the greatest. He's ignoring all of these signs, and I don't want to say he's like doing this for his own gain, because we know he loves Patroclus. But at the same time, his send off to Patroclus was very very ambiguous, very weird. Like, it was hard to tell if he was telling him to be careful out of concern. I mean, obviously he's concerned for him, but when he says, come back, he cites his own glory. He cites his own his own honor and glory and fame. In this passage, he also apparently had access to this very critical information that maybe should have signaled him to not let Patroclus go out.
Yeah, definitely. Achilles has a lot of faults that get kind of revealed throughout the course of the Iliad. And I think that, one of the ones we're seeing here is, our boy doesn't really know how to handle his emotions that well. He needs a good therapist. But B, I mean, there's this notion of what a Homeric hero is versus what we think of a hero is. And
yeah.
American heroes tend to be like, or modern heroes rather, tend to be like Captain America. They are out to sacrifice themselves for the people, for the greater good. And that's not what Achilles wants to do. He's in it for the glory. That's the entire reason he is here, to kind of rack up all of that XP and become the greatest warrior ever, right? He's power leveling here. And, he also tends to throw fits when other people try and take his loot. Loot drops is a very big issue in the Iliad for sure. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm categorizing Briseis and the other Trojan women as loot, because obviously they are not. They're people who get very poorly treated. But, Achilles
they
and the
are
other...
objectified for the sake of looting.
Yeah. Achilles and the other Greeks very much see them as, a prize to be won. So... within that, we see Achilles kind of negotiating, his love for Patroclus, his love for loot and XP and glory, and also this kind of inability to rationalize how he's feeling about things and to kind of get these strong emotions under control.
I know we've talked...
rationalize. Oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, I know we've talked before with previous guests and also with each other about kind of my view on the leading men in the Iliad, Agamemnon and Achilles. And of course, we're talking now about Achilles, but what you said about Achilles kind of like needing therapy and that emotional instability is also something that I've attributed to Agamemnon. I think this is this is certainly one of the books where you see Achilles in this place, especially when he will receive the news that Patroclus is actually dead, and he goes out of his mind. Yeah. But I think it's really interesting, because one of our previous guests, I was talking about Agamemnon's kind of instability. Like, he kind of makes me uncomfortable, and I also think he needs a therapist. One of our previous guests asked, like, do you also feel that way about Achilles, though? And I was like, yes. because we've had this conversation about, how people tend to sympathize with Achilles a lot and kind of take his side, because in the beginning you see that he's clearly the wronged one. But both of them make me uncomfortable. They both really don't have a very good handle on their emotions as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it makes other people uncomfortable. And I think in the case of Achilles, it kind of really scares other people. At the end of book 17, Antilochus is going out to Achilles with all this anticipation of how poorly he's going to take the news that Patroclus is dead. So leading into this with this kind of new knowledge that we have of this prophecy that he's heard about the fact that Patroclus will die, and the way that you kind of just couch that within his overall kind of instability, I find that fascinating.
So I don't know how Achilles' immortality or his godhood is actually represented. But before I read the Iliad, I had it in my mind that Achilles had this sort of adamantium skin or whatever, except for his heel. But that doesn't seem to bear out in the Iliad. So I don't know how exactly to view that kind of his invincibility. When I was first reading the Iliad, the thing that caught my eye was the passage where Antilochus, as you mentioned, he's delivered the news, and Achilles is sort of weeping, and Antilochus is holding his hands for fear that he might, slash his own throat. That doesn't seem like a possibility for someone who is made of iron or what have you. My modern knowledge of Achilles, that image of him being invulnerable everywhere except for his heel, I'm not sure exactly how to process that knowledge, especially with, there's not just this, but he also needs armor.
Yeah, I think you've definitely, got a point there. And as far as the armor goes, I mean, yes, it's physical protection, but it's also very much a status symbol for Greek warriors. And that's why we see Hector working so hard to take that armor away from Patroclus, because, he wants, that glory. He wants that status. And I can't remember what book it's in. Have you all covered the Glaucus and Diomedes exchange yet?
Yes.
I
think we have, haven't we?
I think so. Yeah. This
Okay.
Was this in book? Wait. Yes. That was in book 6, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It's pretty early on.
Yeah, when they meet and they're like, "Oh, my father housed your father, and
we could have been
we're brothers by
brothers.
hospitality,
Mhm.
and let's trade armor."
Yeah.
And Diomedes gets the better end of the deal.
Yeah, exactly. Of course he does, because he's Greek. But it's also this idea of the armor being more than just protection. So I think we do see that playing into this part of the story as well, as we just need a way for Achilles to get this god-made armor. That's not going to happen unless something happens to his other set. So it's a little bit of a plot magic going on too, I think.
I guess before we get to the armor, to the shield itself, we can highlight really quick. Well, for one thing, I want to highlight just really quickly the fact that Hera can pull the sun out of the sky. It's so brief. It's 4 lines, but she causes night to happen, and the line is
I have it in front of me if you want.
yeah, sure, go for it.
Well, which part? The part where she actually drives the sun?
Yeah, when she pulls it down.
Okay, so
pulls it down out of the sky.
Now Hera, the ox-eyed queen of heaven, drove the sun, untired and all unwilling, to sink in the ocean's depths, and the sun went down at last, and brave Achaeans ceased the grueling clash of arms, the leveling rout of war. That's badass.
Totally.
She literally brought the night by telling the sun, "Hey, time to go down."
Yeah, usual day-night cycles, I guess, are subject to changes. And also, I guess, cash in on our discussion in book 17, we have a wonderful scene between Polydamas and Hector, where Polydamas is giving good counsel, and Hector is just foaming at the mouth to fight, and he sways everyone. Everyone is interested. In a way, it's like when we spoke about how infectious, or rather, when I spoke about how infectious Idomeneus and Meriones, how much fun they're having in war. perhaps that is what Hector is imparting in his sort of impassioned speech. Even if it's not, it doesn't make sense. It can't even be true. Like, he's bragging that he can fight Achilles himself because he's so pumped up. And anyone who has their wits about them, and the passage says that Athena, sweeps these wits away. But anyone who would have their wits about them would know that this is nonsense. And I guess this is the last time, or one of the last times, that Hector will turn away good advice. I can't remember if he has one more instance of that before he's killed by Achilles.
But this is a conversation we've gone back and forth on. Just to give you some context, we've kind of talked about the parallel between Nestor and the Achaeans, who seem to actually really listen to his advice, versus Hector and Polydamas. And we both kind of feel for Polydamas a little bit, because Hector never really seems to listen to him, and I find that kind of fascinating.
Like, it's always hard to tell, like, what is coming from the gods and what's a part of their character. Sometimes it's told explicitly, and sometimes it's just could be, it could be the gods, could be the gods' will coming out. Sometimes we have no idea, and I think this is one of them. Athena has swept away the wits of the people who are listening to Hector, but is Zeus's will being imposed on Hector as well? Is he changing his heart?
I mean, we also have to remember that these people have been stuck inside Troy for 9 years at this point.
That is one thing that that Hector does mention, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, Hector finally gets something going for him. He gets the armor of Achilles, even though that's pretty much, what's sealing his death. It's still probably, like, the biggest victory that he's seen in, the better part of a decade. So it's understandable that he would want to kind of go and Leroy the Greek army a bit.
I love that reference so much. For any of you not familiar, Leroy Jenkins, just look that up on YouTube.
Yep.
But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think after 9 years, you kind of just want to strike while the iron is hot. And boy, is that iron hot. It could not be hotter. You just got, the big guy's armor. And you want to show it off, but also you kind of just want to end this whole thing.
Yeah, this is his one opportunity. And so I guess it makes sense a little bit why Hector and others would sort of be resistant to Polydamas. Because, they have this momentum that they never before thought they could even hope to achieve. And, Hector says, Zeus has given us glory. Why would you tell us to turn back now? That's foolishness. And of course, Polydamas is right. But I guess we can understand why Hector would say that. So yeah, I would be quite amenable to the idea that this is all Hector. So I guess we can move on from all that. The juicy bits are right up ahead. Thetis has gone up to Olympus, and there's one thing that I think is funny before we get to the actual making of Achilles' shield and armor. Thetis is greeted by, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Charis, one of the Graces. Thetis having said anything, Charis goes to get Hephaestus, and she says, "Hey, Thetis wants a favor from you." There's no presumption that she was there on, like, a social visit or anything. She's like, hey, she needs something. And this doesn't seem to change how good-natured Hephaestus is.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, he owes Thetis a lot of favors.
Yeah, I mean, Thetis basically saved his ass. After he was...
He saved a lot of asses.
Yeah. But... if you followed the story that Hera basically chucked him off of Olympus, or Zeus did, or whatever, it was the sea nymphs who basically saved him and brought him to Lesbos so that he could grow up. I mean, yeah, he owes her a lot, but also I imagine he probably doesn't get that many friendly visitors either.
No, although, again, this isn't really a friendly visit, right? As Charis rightly notes, she's here for a favor. She's not here to hang out and vibe with Hephaestus.
Right.
But we can jump directly into the titular shield. Dr. Kira, if you can help us, that would be great. I've written down all of the, I guess, images that have been implanted onto this shield, and I can't make heads or tails of them. Maybe you can help us. Do you mind if, for my own benefit and for the benefit of anyone listening, what these images are? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Before we get to that, I'd just like to point out that Hephaestus has literal automatons in his house.
Yes. Yeah.
It's super cool.
Yes, his house is the coolest house on Olympus, I swear. He's got just like
He's got
these...
ladies made of gold, right?
Yeah, ladies made of gold who act like real people, and he's got like self-operating bellows that like he can control with his voice. It's a crazy, crazy cool house.
I kind of think of him as almost like a mad scientist at times.
Yeah, but also he's got so much creative energy in him. I mean, he is he's a god of crafts, but he's very much a god of creation as well. Not in, flesh and blood so much, but he has the ability to, take these metals and make them into things that are almost indistinguishable from real life. And we see that with his sort of household of robot ladies. And we also see that a lot in the shield as well.
So here's what I have for the shield. I don't know how he fits all this on the shield. See, it starts with the Earth, sky, and sea, and constellations, which is like pretty straightforward. And then it continues on with a description of 2 cities. The first city is filled with weddings and celebrations, but there's a quarrel over murder and a blood price, followed by a call for a judge. And the second city that he's made is a city that's surrounded, with the attackers sort of uncertain of how to handle the loot of the city. And then there's a violent encounter. And that's followed up with a field tilled for the 3rd time. And then there's a king's estate with a great harvest happening. And it's overseen by the king, and there's a slaughtered ox. And then it goes down to a vineyard where children pick the grapes and play music. There is a herd of cattle set upon by a lion, a meadow where shepherds watch their flocks, a circle of dancing. This is followed by a circle of dancing girls and boys, and this is followed finally by the ocean river. And so this is all on Achilles' shield, and this is a abridged version of it, of course. There are more details in the actual text. But yeah, this is sort of confounding to me, and presumably Llama as well. I do not know what I'm supposed to imagine when I read this.
I have kind of a more simple first thought, which is like, how big is this damn shield?
That's a good question. I would assume...
it's round.
Yeah, it's definitely round. And we know it has 5 layers, and I don't think we actually get like a size. I assume that it's small enough for Achilles to carry, but maybe a little bit bigger than normal men could carry. I mean, that's not supported by the text, but I'm just assuming that since he's a demigod. And
well, I think there's a little bit of support of that in the text, though, for when I think at some point Achilles asks for like, a shield or something and says like, whose shield am I supposed to take? Only Ajax's is enough for me. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about giant Ajax. Yeah. So that gives me the impression that like the kind of shield that he is going to carry is something that no other man can really bear, and is probably pretty fucking massive.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and if we look at like really early Greek art, the soldiers are usually shown with like a big round shield that goes from like between their chin and their nose down to about their knees. So it's gonna cover most of his body anyways. And if we're talking about a larger than life guy, it's gonna be a larger than life shield as well.
Can you shed some light on what's even going on? Like,
yeah.
I didn't ask for this, like when we're reading, I think we can usually, as sort of lay people, we can, even if we don't understand exactly the tale that's being told, we can kind of get the gist. This is like the one time where I just can't get it.
You're gonna have to trust me here when I say it's related to what's going on. We'll get there eventually, but what we've got here is what's called an ekphrasis. And it is a poetic device that is literally like making a picture with words. So it's when poets take something, usually like a description of a material object, and describe it so vibrantly that you can literally see a picture inside your head of it. It's like you're watching a cutscene or something. That's how well they're describing it. And, it's meant to go up against other forms of storytelling. So in the ancient world, you had basically three main types of storytelling. First, there was the oral tradition, so telling stories by memory with your voice. Second was artwork. If you didn't have a bard around, you're going to be learning a lot of stories from the material goods around you. And, that's going to be a lot more common than traveling bards or...
Like all those wonderful images on pots.
Exactly, yeah. Pots on metal, on shields if you're lucky. It was a huge vector for myth knowledge. And then, eventually we have texts. Not at the point when the Iliad was composed. So this is really, a poet going up against probably some really famous piece of art. So we've got this contest in between what a poet can do with words and what a piece of art can do with images. And the poet here is trying to say that, okay, I am just as good as that super impressive piece of art that you learned about a myth from, because I can do this with words and it is just as vibrant to you as if you were looking at the shield itself.
So in book 2, we were talking about how toward the end with the catalog of ships, it's just as much a flex as it is a integral part of the story. The poet is showing off their skills. I guess this is another one of those instances in a way.
Yes, definitely. And we get something similar in the Baroque period, actually. It's called a paragone, and it's when painters try and go up against sculptors of marble. So if you've heard of Bernini, he was a big one.
Yeah.
Did a lot of mythological statues like the Apollo and Daphne. But the idea was, could you be more lifelike in marble without color or in, colored paintings that weren't 3D? And again, there's this battle back and forth between the artists as to who could be more realistic, who could be more impressive and true to life. So again, just to reiterate, this is a poet who is trying to one up all of, his other material artist friends.
I think this is really interesting because, when you're talking about this, first of all, I'm absolutely seeing what you're telling us in the sense of, these are such vivid descriptions that they're almost brought to life. I personally love opera. And I think one of the things that I love about opera so much is the way that they can write music in such a way that makes you feel things. If you've ever heard of La Traviata, which is about, a woman with consumption, you can feel her difficulty breathing by the end as she's dying. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen this centuries old opera.
Or anyone with consumption. They die.
Yeah. But it reminds me of that, how musicians can write swells of music in such a way, and how, operatic singers can interpret that in a way that actually makes you feel what's going on. That's kind of the feeling that I get from these types of descriptions. And I think that's kind of what you're saying is almost the point of this, is to evoke that feeling out of you. And I just am imagining it as, spoken word. That is kind of what pulled into my mind.
Yeah, totally.
And I guess this also explains, to me anyway, why we have such a vivid description of this thing here, but almost nowhere else. We've talked about how people are given very vague descriptions, and places are given sort of they're given mood lighting, and they're given some shadows, and you have a general sense of where they are, but you're not given exact specifications or anything like that. But we're getting that here. I guess this helps me conceptualize the why of this particular section and passage.
Right, and that leaves the what.
Yes, what?
Or
exactly.
What the hell? Maybe more accurate. Right, so, as I said with this house, we're dealing with a god here who can, make metal into a lifelike creation. so he can, make golden women to tend his house that behave like real people. And, we see that playing out in this passage as well, because we kind of lose the sense that, this is a shield that we're looking at, and it starts reading a lot like a description or an actual story. So, he's saying things like, there he made the earth, and there the sky and the sea. We know that this is a shield intellectually, but at the same time, it's, kind of in the sense that Hephaestus is making this world. And he's making sort of this, like, living experience that, eventually he's going to give to Achilles. And this is happening at a pivotal point in the book, right? So Patroclus is dead. We've got Achilles finally coming out of his grief and his anger, and he's going to go out and actually fight some Trojans. This is also playing into, kind of the end of his story and what he chose as life for himself. So just as a reminder for people who may just be tuning in, the idea was that he could either, live a very long, uneventful life by himself with no glory, or he could live a very short life that was filled with glory. So he chose the latter. And what we get in this shield is it's a vision of those two choices for him. So in the very center, we've got Earth, Sun, Sky, Ocean, but we get a lot of focus on the constellations, right? And those are what the Greeks used to navigate by, especially in ships. So, if you are sailing among the Greek islands, imagine yourself at night. It's dark. There aren't going to be many lights out. You need to have a good idea of what the landscape is like, and you need to know which direction you're going in. That is going to be where the constellations come in. And those are going to be able to help you find your way. So the very center of the shield then is kind of like a navigational guide almost that's sitting in between these two different cities. And the city at war is obviously very similar to what Achilles is currently in, right? It is, a divided army, debating whether to plunder the city. They've got wives and children standing guard on the ramparts, watching the men march out to war. Ares and Athena are both there. We've seen this in the Iliad already. It's already happened. And
there's a brutality to one side and a sort of, a focus on more judicial and civil things on the other.
Yeah. But even more than that, we kind of see Achilles' story as it might have played out if he had stayed at home. So let me scroll down to the passage here. So in the peaceful city, we get weddings and wedding feasts. We get brides who are being marched through the streets, very much in contrast to the actual kidnapping and raping of women that we see happening in the Iliad. Here we have actual marriages. At Troy we have very much not actual marriages. We get, young men who are dancing through the streets. They've got flutes and harps. Women are admiring them. It's kind of a parallel to watching, the men march out to war as well. And then, eventually we get this really interesting passage about this one guy who is trying to get the blood price for a kinsman who was just murdered. And, don't forget, we have just heard about Patroclus getting murdered and Achilles marching out to demand the blood price for that.
Oh, okay. I guess I never made the connection between, this little event happening and the events of the Iliad.
Yeah. As you're saying this, I'm kind of reading through this and following along with you and realizing actually just how closely this kind of follows what we've seen so far. And I'm not going to lie, it's completely blowing my mind about this chapter.
Yeah, that's how good Hephaestus is. He's, taking, Achilles' fate, both his chosen fate and this other potential fate that he could have chosen, and he's putting them on this shield that Achilles is receiving in this pivotal moment in the story. And, we learn that if Achilles had decided to stay at home, instead of going out and like murdering an entire field of Trojans and dragging a body around an entire friggin' city, for a week, it would have been decided by 2 elders of the village peacefully. But, that's not what we get. Immediately after that, we get the other city camped, a dividing army gleaming in battle gear. So, yeah, we've got that navigation panel right in the middle, and then on either side of that, there's the 2 directions in which Achilles could have gone, and we end that passage with the direction in which he did go, which is short life but lots of glory.
I guess I'm baffled at how I didn't connect this, especially reading the city that's surrounded by like I guess a divided army, because they're under siege and they're looking to break the siege and they send people out and which is exactly what's been happening. My mind is also blown.
Yeah, this is absolutely blowing my mind.
But it seems so obvious.
Another image that's kind of coming to me, or kind of a representation in art that it makes me think of, is like old tapestries that were used as, the woven, and some of these old tapestries are massive, like can fill up an entire castle wall or something like that. And they have these intricate stories woven into them, and I just popped into my head like Hephaestus is weaving a big ass tapestry that is a shield, and it's metal.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a reason why he and Athena are the 2 craft gods. I mean, she does the weaving, but he is doing very, very similar things in metal.
Yeah.
As well. And I believe we do get a few weaving metaphors in here where it talks about him like weaving in the silver and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then I guess we go from the 2 cities are, I think, the most elaborate, and for me, especially when I first read them, but even now, having just recently reread it, the most disarming passages. And then following that, we have these shorter, smaller descriptions of these, little snapshots of the world, a world. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sudden shift, right? We go from peaceful city to city that is being absolutely fucked up by war to, oh, look, it's plow land. And this dude has a guy waiting with a bunch of wine for him at the end. That's nice. But it doesn't really track that well with the actual war city. So if we're mapping this out, we've got the 2 cities as kind of like halves around the central start panel, right? And then we've got all of these little vignettes that are kind of, ringing that in a circle as well. So I forget how many there are. It's like 8 or something, 6 or 8. But
9, or was it? Or,
9, maybe, yeah, whatever number there are.
My guess is 9.
Yeah, they're basically encircling the 2 cities, and then we have the band of silver around the rim that stands for the ocean. I mean, this is very much Greek life outside of war. We get much more of a focus on what people do to live, what normal life usually looks like. 10-year war at Troy is obviously an anomaly. Most Greek citizens are not going to be engaging in that. We know that because we keep hearing the Greek heroes talk about all the people they left behind. And, I think what Hephaestus is doing here is he's, reminding us that there is kind of life beyond the war. And that, as much as the heroes may be focused on this, eventually the war is going to end and people are going to go back to, growing vineyards and herding their cattle and plowing their fields. And, essentially that's what Greek life is. It's not all heroic battle all the time. It's the sort of, daily routine.
These read like little ultra cultural images, like stuff that you'd know what they are if you were there. Like if we were to adapt this for a modern day, you could easily replace one of them with and a guy stands on the street corner to hail a taxi. But when the taxi arrives, he doesn't have enough money to pay for it, and that would be the end of that. And that's just a little relatable, understandable moment that says, hey, this is like not, as you said, this
Mhm.
is not, this is very much not the war that you're in right now. This is a majority of what Greek life is, or what life is.
Yeah.
It also strikes me as kind of like in the context of what we've just talked about in terms of it being a picture of what Achilles could have had.
Mm-hmm.
These vignettes also continue to kind of serve that purpose of
Mhm.
saying, like, not only is there life beyond the war, there's life, you know, beyond this whole conflict, but this is also the kind of life that you could have if you weren't about to die.
Yeah. Yeah, and like we're hyper focused on Troy in these two cities, but there's an entire Greek world beyond that that is just kind of out there doing its own thing, even while all of these heroes are fighting.
Is there a great significance in like Hephaestus himself having made it? Like, obviously we can say this work of art is saying this, but
Mhm.
is Hephaestus saying this? Is this coming from his heart? Is this
Yeah.
is this from him?
That's a great question. I mean, Hephaestus is a really interesting god.
I don't know very much about him, and the Iliad doesn't give much of him either.
Right. So, I mean, on the one hand, you kind of have this outcast from Olympus, because he is a disabled god. They call him the lame god in this translation quite often. When he got chucked off of Olympus, you know, he landed weird. His foot didn't heal quite right. But, you know, that's not the focus in any of this book on him. The focus is on how he moves so easily around his house, how he can make these marvelous things.
It does seem like he lives in the day to day with his like
Yeah.
automatons and his bellows.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
stuff.
he's not a god who really goes out and, like, you know, is a patron to heroes or helps guide affairs or stuff like that. He's a craftsman. He lives in his forge. I mean, yeah, he does have some mythology where he interacts, you know, nicely and not so nicely with the other gods. There's a whole thing with Aphrodite that is, you know,
Yeah.
a whole thing. But
And he does show the force of his
Mhm.
strength in, I think, book 21 when he sets fire to the
yeah,
river.
yeah. I mean, he's also the god of fire. So he's got all of
Yeah.
this, like, you know, creative power and creative ability to sort of generate things that gets focused into his metalwork. As far as, you know, him kind of using this to speak to Achilles, I'm not sure how far I would push that. I mean, so for example, if we look at him in Phoenix Immortals Rising, for example, he is the artiste god. And, you know, again, there's not that much of a focus on his disability, which is great because I think that we tend to blow that out of proportion in modern times by focusing on that and kind of that as a mark against him rather than a mark in his favor. And if anyone's interested, Let's Talk About Miss Baby just did a couple of great episodes on him as sort of a disabled god and how he gets treated in both modern receptions and ancient myth, which is absolutely fabulous. Highly recommend it. But you know,
Yeah.
in Phoenix, you know, he is you know, very much an artiste who does sensitive compositions and kind of has this this like story inside of him that he wants to get out, that he expresses through his art. I'm not sure if we can put that so much back on ancient literature as a personal characteristic.
Perhaps the easiest
Yeah.
reading is that just he has the wisdom to recognize that this is the way the world
Yeah.
is. You know, it has this, you know, wonderful duality, dreadful and wonderful
Mhm.
duality, where, you know, we have the violence, but we also have, I mean, a majority of the shield seems to be like this normal everyday life. The
Mhm.
only real violent part is that second city that's besieged. And so perhaps this isn't from like Hephaestus to
Mhm.
Achilles, but if Hephaestus were to make something and he has this the wisdom to see the world and like as it is, this is what he would make.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of looking at it.
Then I guess we have to ask, how are we supposed to read Achilles carrying this? Like I mean, Achilles I don't think comments on this whack-ass
Mhm.
shield, but one of the things that I love about the Iliad is that it forces us to remember these images. It blew my mind when it was pointed out to me that Hector is wearing Achilles' armor as he's fighting Achilles. I didn't really think about that image. Like, I knew he was wearing what Patroclus was wearing, but I didn't make that whole connection. And so we have this very interesting image of Achilles striking down an image of himself. But, we also have to remember that he's carrying this shield, even if the poem never says, and don't forget, he's got this cool shield. We remember that, and he's carrying it. And so if we're to, I guess, take this interpretation and understanding of this work of art by Hephaestus, what are we supposed to get out of this? It seems too detailed and too important to just overlook or pass by without consideration.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you could go with a simple explanation, which is that, this passage was ekphrasis. It served its purpose. It painted kind of a picture of a story within a story, and then we move on. Action resumes as normal. But, I mean, you could also get super meta with it and say that, Achilles is not only, fighting this version of his past self, he's carrying his choices on his arm, right? He's carrying, the Greek world.
Interesting way of thinking about it.
I
with
love
him
that.
as he goes into battle. So, yeah, I think this is one of those things that's kind of meant to be open-ended, so you can take what you need from it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different directions that you could go in, and I mean, I don't think that any of them is more right than
That's
the
one
other.
of the things that I love most about reading the Iliad and diving into it is so much is subject to interpretation, but it is not bound by interpretation, which is to say that you can interpret it, but there's also a million ways that you can do that, and none of them is necessarily wrong in any given situation. There's just so much room to let your mind wander and think of all the possible meanings, and maybe some of them are outright wrong. I know I've been there before. Maybe some of them are, really subjective and you can't really put your finger on it. And then some of them are just really throw your hands in the air and say, what the fuck?
Yeah, one of the great triumphs of the Iliad that I'm understanding more and more as I'm talking about it with Llama is that how almost value free these characters and these scenarios are presented. The poet rarely casts at least as best as I can tell, rarely casts an absolute moral judgment on a character or an action or whatever. It's to you to retain these images and these actions in your head and then understand what happens next based on that memory. And that's, I think, what makes reading and rereading the Iliad so much more interesting than anything else I've picked up. Since I mentioned book 2, I'll refer to it really quickly before we close out, unless there's more to understand about this shield. I remember in book 2, I found it very funny that there are these pages and pages of all these Achaean forces, all their ships, all their kings, and then when we get to the end, you have a little bit of space for the Trojans. We have a page and a half, and I find it funny that after all this hullabaloo about this shield, we just kind of get, and once the god made that, he made a breastplate, and he made a helmet, and he made him greaves. And there you go. Well, let's do one for me.
There definitely seem to be these passages where they'll just the narrator or the poet just hyper focuses in on this one thing that you have to know all about it, and then oh, by the way, there was this too.
It feels almost like they're just going through a formality. I don't know if this is a worthy criticism of the poem, or if it's just another thing that's just, I guess, a feature of the form.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I also just love how that little blurb that you just mentioned is shortly followed by, and Thetis took the stuff and she brought it to Achilles.
And we just get to the end.
And you just get to the end, and then the next book, it's not really mentioned. It goes back into, the grief of Achilles.
Yeah, and she's like waving it in front of his face like it's something shiny to distract him from crying.
Kind of does feel like that a
Yep.
little bit.
I'll have to refresh myself. It's actually been a while since I've looked into book 19. It's like the shortest book.
It is
It's a
very
really
brief
easy
book,
read.
yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think I certainly feel like I have a much better understanding of what's going on with this shield, because up until now I've just been lost as to how to read this
It's
passage.
dense.
So
It's really dense.
it's not even so much that it's dense. It's just like I've had like this happens in the Iliad in the Odyssey as well, where Odysseus goes to the underworld and it describes this stuff, but I have no idea what I'm supposed to be imagining right now. It's just I don't I'm so distracted by what image I'm supposed to produce in my brain that I can barely grapple with the text sometimes. And this is certainly one of those times, and I feel more equipped to grapple with the text now.
I mean, as I said before, you just blew my mind. Like, absolutely just... I mean, it definitely changes, I think, the way I'm going to read this book in the future.
Mhm.
I think it changes,
Thank
how
you.
I think of this shield. It certainly, gave me more depth to the character of Hephaestus, which I love, because I love Hephaestus.
He's
I
so
think
cool.
he's a fascinating god. I love the
Yeah.
image of, a house full of robot ladies.
Yep.
Metallic robot ladies.
As one
That's
does.
fantastic.
I love the simple idea of Achilles carrying his choices on his arm.
Yeah.
Like that's like it's simple. I really like it.
I love it. Thank you so much for, joining us and just adding so much depth to this pretty incredible chapter when you think about it of the Iliad. Like it seems like something that, can get you into that eyes glazed over place. But I have a really newfound appreciation for it now, I think.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this book, and it's fabulous to talk about it with both of you.
I guess before we close out and let you go, is there anything you'd care to plug or point us to? You mentioned one thing earlier. I can't remember what it is now.
Oh, was it the other
It was,
podcast?
It's like some episode. Yeah.
Which I definitly want to know about, because
some additional
Yeah.
reading. I think.
Yeah,
you
it's
mentioned.
a podcast called Let's Talk About Myths, baby.
Nice.
Yeah. So Liv, the woman who runs it, she just put out 2 episodes on Hephaestus as sort of a disabled god. I mean, they're fabulous. They will completely like reshape the way you think about him. I did an episode on Cassandra in Assassin's Creed Odyssey with her a while ago, so that's on her site somewhere. But highly recommend that podcast. And if you want to follow along with me, I often post video game rantings and stuff about Elder Scrolls, Assassin's Creed, Hades, and stuff on my Twitter account at FlavianSophist. So you can find me there.
Awesome. And be sure to leave plenty of links in the description of wherever you happen to be listening to this podcast. So yeah, thank you again, Dr. Kira Jones. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here and share your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
And I guess the usual procedure is, Dr. Daniel will give us a tag.
Listen to it. Listen to it, people. Listen to Dr. Dan.
We'll lead into that tag. But as with our previous guest, he will not be commenting on this particular book. But we, of course, as I said, encourage you to listen to it anyway. So without further ado, here's Dr. Daniel. Thank you again, Dr. Kira Jones.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel, otherwise known as Dr. Daniel, Dr. Dan, or the Dancing Grad, and I'm here to offer some thoughts on Wriste and Llama's conversation about the Iliad, Book 17. I will be deferring to my colleague, Dr. Kira Jones, on Book 18, but I had a few thoughts about the first half of the conversation in this episode that I wanted to share. First off, Wriste and Llama made the excellent point that Menelaus's Aristeia in Book 17 seems quite different from the other Aristeia we see throughout the Iliad. In the other Aristeia that we've seen, Aristeia usually means body count, wherein the warrior in question is killing a whole bunch of people. This was particularly notable in Book 5 when Diomedes went on a rampage on the battlefield. I think one element of the Aristeia of Menelaus that we need to emphasize here is its defensive nature compared to the offensive nature of other Aristei. In Book 17, we transition to an Achaean army that is now down one of its most well-known and most beloved members, Patroclus. So the objective of the Aristeia in Book 17 isn't to rack up a bigger body count. It's to protect the one body that we need to bring back to the Achaean camp. Recall that one of the worst things that could happen for a warrior on the battlefield was to not receive a burial. If Patroclus' body had fallen into the hands of the Trojans, they undoubtedly would have desecrated it. So Menelaus' Aristeia here seems more external than internal. He's not striving for glory for himself, but to protect Patroclus' body and the Greeks around him. I also wanted to comment on the fact of Hector wearing the arms of Achilles. Wriste mentioned at the very beginning of the episode that the Iliad for him occupies an interesting place somewhere in between a play and a novel. One theatrical concept that I think is appropriate in this context is that of an essential prop, some sort of physical object that carries special significance for a character or multiple characters within a play. Think, for example, of the skull in Shakespeare's Hamlet. The armor of Achilles is bound intimately with the conception of Achilles himself. Even Patroclus knew this when he told Achilles that even the very sight of his armor will rouse the Greeks. So I absolutely agree with Wriste and Llama that the act of Hector wearing the arms of Achilles invites comparisons, both to Achilles and to Patroclus. But what I want to suggest is that the comparison might not necessarily be to show how Hector is not worthy to wear the arms of Achilles or anything like that, but to engender sympathy for the character of Hector. We've seen what happens to somebody who assumes this essential prop that wasn't meant for them, when Patroclus donned this armor in order to try to rouse the Greeks, but ended up getting killed by Hector at the very end of it all. Hector similarly has no sort of cosmic or divine claim to the arms of Achilles. And the same fate that awaited Patroclus now awaits Hector, as Zeus makes very clear in Book 17. The donning of the armor will also be Hector's downfall in Book 22, since because Achilles knows the armor so intimately, he also knows its weak points the best. Hector is doomed to die, a fact that he shares with the previous occupant of Achilles' armor, Patroclus. So perhaps the comparison here isn't just an apples to oranges comparison of who is more or less worthy to wear the arms of Achilles. Perhaps there's also an element of an apples-to-apples comparison, two people drawn together by the same fate using the same essential prop of Achilles' armor. Alright, that's about all I have, so I'm going to toss it back now to Wriste and Llama.
Thank you once again, Dr. Daniel, for your time and insight. Always enjoy hearing what you have to say about our discussions, and thank you, dear listener, for tuning in. We hope you'll take the opportunity to read along with us, since there's plenty to love in these stories, and please keep an eye out for our follow-up episodes by following us on Twitter at Homer_bound, or wherever you happen to be listening to us now. We hope to see you in the next episode. See you then.